All right, guys, welcome back. Our last section for this week is 10.3, which is fermentation. So let's get into it. So in the absence of oxygen, fermentation helps release energy from your food molecules by producing ATP. So we're going to go through the different steps, the different types of fermentation, etc. So here's the ATP being produced, right? And you can see there are two. Just like in regular glycolysis, right? So the glycolysis does not change. We have glucose being broken down. We have 2 ADP coming in and being charged up to 2 ATP. We have 2 NADH being produced and 2 pyruvic acid. So there are two slightly different forms of the process. We have alcoholic fermentation and we have lactic acid fermentation. So alcoholic fermentation, this is the process that would create alcohol in, for example, beer, wine, liquor. It's also the process that produces bubbles in your bread. So this is very useful for a lot of different things. Lactic acid fermentation, this is the process that creates lactic acid in your muscles and when you work out. If you felt like soreness, a lot of times that's attributed to lactic acid buildup. Although they have kind of disproven that in the past couple of years, maybe the jury's still out on that. So let's go a little bit deeper. Okay, so alcoholic fermentation, there are a few microorganisms that can do alcoholic fermentation. Yeast are one of them. So if you've ever used yeast to bake bread, you have done experiments with alcoholic fermentation. So in alcoholic fermentation, pyruvic acid and NADH produce alcohol, okay, 2-ethyl alcohol. And what else? So we have 2CO2 that you can see here. And we have NADH being used, which is producing 2 NAD+. So pyruvic acid plus NADH yields alcohol, CO2, and NAD+. Okay. In lactic acid fermentation, we have pyruvic acid, we have NADH, and what's being produced? We have NAD+, we have 2-lactic acid, that doesn't really matter because it's a byproduct, but we're going to put it up here. So lactic acid and NAD+, okay? So you can see the differences here. We have CO2 being produced in alcoholic fermentation. We do not have CO2 being produced in lactic acid fermentation. And the CO2 is incredibly important. So if you've ever baked bread, you know that you use yeast to help make that bread nice and fluffy and light. And it's because those yeast literally will sit there and break down sugars, okay? And they produce this CO2. And that CO2 creates the bubbles that are in bread, makes it rise, and really, makes bread the wonderful thing that it is. It's also useful in creating, bubbles in alcoholic beverages, things like that. So humans are lactic acid fermenters. We're not alcoholic fermenters, we're lactic acid fermenters, right? So during brief periods without oxygen, many of the cells in our bodies are capable of producing ATP by lactic acid fermentation. So the cells that are best adapted to doing that are muscle cells, which is why a lot of times you'll get sore muscles because of lactic acid. And they often need a large supply of ATP for those rapid bursts of energy. So, everyone talks about lactic acid buildup in your muscles and how that can cause cramping and soreness. So until recently, like I mentioned, many people thought that lactic acid buildup was responsible for that muscle fatigue and soreness. So researchers in the past couple of years have found out lactic acid can actually be used as a fuel by mitochondria to make energy. And that doesn't necessarily make muscles sore. The jury's still out on that one. So in this example here with the swimmer, at the beginning of their swim or their race, their principal source of energy was the ATP that was already in their cells' muscles, okay? After a little while, what's going to happen is they're going to then switch over to ATP produced by lactic acid fermentation. So long-term energy. So for exercise longer than about 90 seconds, cellular respiration is the only way to continue generating a supply of ATP. So How do you know if you are performing cellular respiration? You're producing an excess of carbon dioxide. So if we were in the classroom, there's a really cool lab that we do, or I've done every year, where I have you guys blow into a CO2 indicator and time the amount of time it takes to change colors. And then I have you guys run for about a minute and then go back and do the same thing over again. And the amount of time it takes for that indicator to change drops by about from about usually about 15 seconds to about 3 seconds. So you can see that you're producing more CO2. And more CO2 production means that you are doing cellular respiration at a faster rate, right? So I hope that that makes sense. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out. Make sure you answer the question on this video lecture. And I hope you have a wonderful week.